Hi, I'm Jimmy Butler, and welcome to the Agile Digest, where we have right-sized topics covered in just minutes. Now, typically my digests are about 3 to 6 minutes. Today, I'm going to walk you through a full-blown presentation titled Measuring Success in Your Agile Teams. It should be about 30 minutes. Enjoy. So before we get started, let me give you a little background on me as it pertains to this presentation. I am a PMI certified project management professional. I'm a PMI certified Agile certified practitioner, and I'm a certified Scrum Master through the Scrum Alliance. I have about 18 years of project management experience in web and software, but my last 7 years has been more specific in the federal contracting space, where I've focused on Agile transformation and moving toward product management mindsets in that Agile space. So today, let's rethink everything. Let's rethink everything we think we know about how to measure success in our Agile teams. The challenge I've seen is that teams moving to Agile tend to either force old metrics on new ways of working, they misuse new metrics to fit old ways of thinking, or they use common Agile metrics out of context. The result is just bad data and bad decisions. So my recommendation is this. Let's rethink what success really looks like within an Agile mindset. Let's align everything we do around the 12 principles of Agile, and let's be open to letting go of traditional or common measures. I want you to start thinking about what you're measuring, and is it the right thing? And so in this cartoon, we have Sally, your output isn't cutting it, you're only producing 15 lines of code. And she says, probably sarcastically, what, you're referring to the 15 lines of code that cured cancer? And you say, yeah, that, we really need more. And so what we have here is an outputs versus outcomes focus. And that tends to be organizations' focus a lot of times is how much are we outputting? And whether it's lines of code, which is a real measure for some development teams, it could be your velocity, your number of story points or the number of stories you're outputting. And what it's missing is what's the value of what's being output? And so are you measuring the right thing? The other thing to consider when looking at your measures is it bringing the desired results? So in this cartoon, the manager says, we have to increase velocity. Again, he's output focused. He's thinking about more work being done in the time period. And the team thinks about it and they're like, okay, problem solved. You want increased velocity? We'll give you bigger estimates. Well, as we know, bigger estimates will give you a bigger velocity number, but it doesn't mean that more work's being done. And so what we have is the observer effect or the Hawthorne effect, which says, tell me how you'll measure me and I'll tell you how I'll behave, because people will do what they have to do in order to meet the measure to keep from getting in trouble or from looking bad. So are the measures you're using actually bringing the desired results? And the other thing I want you to consider with your measures is, are we reading it with the right context? So look at this graph on the screen. Is it a rabbit or is it a duck? And that all depends on your perspective, and as it is with all measures and metrics. And the more information you have, the more context you have to wrap around it. So there's a popular example used around Carmelo Anthony, an NBA basketball player, that gets to this point. Carmelo in a particular year was one of the highest scoring players in all the leagues, certainly on his team. And so on its own, that's a great individual statistic. He's a high output producer. And you think, well, he's got to play every minute then. Well, another statistic showed that the team actually had a higher winning percentage when Carmelo did not play. Now, that'll make you scratch your head a little bit, but it just requires a little more digging into the context. We learned that Carmelo is one of the highest scorers because he shoots more than everybody else. But in reality, his shooting percentage, the times he made it compared to shooting, was actually less than the other players on the team. And so now if you take that data and put it in the context, you might conclude that maybe you don't need Carmelo. If the team wins more without him, get rid of him. But there's more data and more context. The reason why he was shooting a lesser percentage was because he's a good ball player, and as a result, a lot of times he's got 2 and 3 people covering him. And his problem was he was trying to make shots despite the extra coverage, which reduces the shooting percentage. But actually, when he's open or one-on-one, he's a pretty good shooter. And so instead of getting rid of Carmelo, if we put everything in the context and understand what's behind the data, we realize that the answer is for Carmelo to pass the ball when he's double and triple teamed, but shoot the ball when he's open or one-on-one. And the team as a whole will have a higher shooting percentage, and that will lead to more wins. So while his individual statistic of output might have gone down, because of the role he played within the team shined. And it's the same way with your Agile teams. Just because a particular developer might have less output on individual stories, and development work than somebody else, doesn't mean that their contributions to the team as a whole aren't impactful. And so that's why we measure teams rather than individuals, and that's why we need to take data in context to understand the root of the problem. So when we talk about measuring success, what do we really mean? Well, the graph I'm showing you is one of those common graphs that you see when you're trying to prove why Agile is better than Waterfall. And it says that, with Agile, you'll have a higher percentage of successful projects, a lower percentage of failed projects. But both of these are based on some common measure of success. And what is that? Well, they're using the definition of that you deliver all the planned requirements in the planned time for the planned budget, or commonly known as on time. So what does it mean to be on time? And is on time really a good measure to be used across both? Let's explore that a little bit. So the question is on time a good measure? And again, it means to deliver all the planned requirements within the planned time. But are all projects that meet this criteria considered successful? And would all projects that fail to meet this criteria be unsuccessful? Let's look at a couple of examples and see. In our first example, we have a project to deliver a certain amount of requirements in 6 months. We find after 2 months that there's a particular requirement that may not provide as much impact as we originally thought, but a change at this point would just jeopardize scope and schedule, so we just implement it the way it was planned. After 4 months, we have new requirements that are proposed. But again, it's expected to jeopardize our schedule, so we defer those requirements. In the end, though, all the planned requirements are finished in 6 months. Was this project successful? Well, by traditional project standards, yes, we did everything we said we were going to do in the time we said we were going to do it. But we're trying to develop an Agile mindset, right? We're trying to march toward Agile principles. So how did we do? Well, we certainly didn't maximize the amount of work not done because we implemented a feature that had very little value when it came down to it. And in fact, a lot of the features we developed probably had less value than the ones we deferred. So we did more less value items than we needed to. Secondly, we didn't welcome changing requirements for sure because we deferred requirements that I'm going to presume here were actually more valuable than some of the ones we implemented. And so we didn't take advantage of the opportunity to deploy the highest value in the time we provided. So by which standards are we to be measured? And was it successful? In the next example, our sprint goal is to deliver user stories 1 through 5. These are our top 5 priorities. Well, after starting the number 1 priority story, the team discovers it's more complicated than anticipated, which sometimes happens, right? So we have a couple of options. We could focus solely on getting item number 1 done, or we could defer number 1 and get items 2 through 5 done. And which one's better? Which option's better? Why? Well, regardless, both options fail the on-time criteria, right? Because we didn't do everything we planned in the time we planned. But does that mean this is an unsuccessful sprint? Well, that depends on our perspective. And what's our common instinct? Probably to get items 2 through 5 done, because after all, 4 or 5 items sounds a whole lot better than just getting 1 item done, right? But that would be output focused. And if it was okay to not do the number 1 story this sprint, then why was it number 1 to begin with? So we have to consider, is the goal to deliver the highest value or the most stories? Now you might argue that items 2 through 5 collectively have more value than number 1, and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but we have to consider what the intent and the motivation is behind what we consider success for this sprint. And if we're able to bend a little bit on what that actually means, if it's not so critical that we get everything we planned done in the time we planned, if we can still consider one of these options successful, then aren't we kind of putting cracks in the foundation of on time? And then is on time as defined really a good measure? So is on time a good measure? Well, how well did this stack up to the Agile principles? And we talk about chasing value, maximizing the value we put in place in the time that we have, that we allow for change, continuous replanning on a sprint-by-sprint basis. Well, in our examples, we didn't do that. We saw that delivering to a plan to the original requirements, we missed the mark on some of these Agile principles. We didn't chase the value we needed. We deferred new requirements. And so if we're going to follow Agile, if we're truly going to welcome change and chase value, then we have to realize we're never going to be able to implement everything that's originally planned. And if that's the case, is this traditional on-time metric really a good measure? So what about imposed deadlines? And sometimes we're given legitimate deadlines to work through, and how do we deal with that? Well, Agile works great with fixed deadlines. It works great with fixed cost. But what it can't work with is fixed scope. Because if we're going to chase value, if we're going to empirically put something out there, learn from it, and adjust from it, we can't really fix scope and hope to deliver the best product anyway. And sometimes you don't even know everything you need up front, which is why Agile is a great method for developing software. And I'll give you an example. The job I had before this managed development teams at the Department of Labor, and we did applications for the programs and things like that. And there was a new program starting up for ex-offenders, people who'd been in jail, to get retrained for jobs, get jobs, do mentoring, follow-up, help get them reintegrated back into things. And it needed a case management system to track all this. Well, we were given 12 months and a set of money, so we knew we had 12 months, a fixed deadline to develop as much as we could. And even with that, we didn't know that we would be able to develop a fully fleshed out system in 12 months. The program was still trying to figure out what it wanted. It knew a lot of the requirements. It didn't know them all. And furthermore, we had a deadline of about 3 months to actually start allowing participants to get information into the system about participants and to start the training, tracking, and things like that. And so there's definitely no way we're going to develop an end-to-end solution in 3 months, much less a fully fleshed out solution to even handle those first 2 workflow phases. So what we had to do was take the information we knew at the time, what were the minimum requirements that we needed, filter out the things that we thought we could do without for now, and go for minimum viable product in the workflow phases that were coming up next. And as we implemented them, we'd work on the next workflow phase and so on and so forth. And then as particular components got used, feedback came in, and so we would work in some of the incremental improvements there. So iteratively and incrementally, we developed out this product within the time frames that we had with the information that we had. And so that's a great example where Agile works great with fixed deadlines, but not necessarily fixed scope. But the reality is sometimes we're given a deadline and somebody's fixing scope with it. And is that a good idea? Well, what's the purpose of the deadline? If there's a legitimate need to have something out there, perhaps not fix every fine detail of the requirements, but at least lay out a minimum viable product and march toward that. But sometimes the purpose is simply a management tactic to get people to work harder, faster, and produce more in a time period than we think they would do otherwise. And I don't know if that really is a lack of trust or it's just old habits, but sometimes that's the purpose. When we put these deadlines out there, what's the reality based on? I mean, do we know technically that we can deliver the fixed scope within the fixed timeline, or is it just wishful thinking? Because if it's not based on reality, we're setting everybody up for failure to begin with. And then you're kind of forcing the team to try to make sure they meet this, so they work overtime, they cut corners and cut quality. And all of this runs counter to Agile principles. I mean, what you're trying to accomplish with your team is a sustainable pace, so that they have high quality at a sustainable pace indefinitely. And so I would say fixed scope with fixed deadlines probably runs counter to that. So I was going through the 11th annual State of Agile report that's put out by version 1, and a couple of things struck me as interesting. When they were asked how success is measured with Agile initiatives, the number one response was on-time delivery, and that's a topic we've been covering here over the last little while. But then the reasons for adopting Agile, they said, were the ability to manage changing priorities. And so I questioned, how do we change priorities? How do we change the scope of what we're doing while delivering to a planned set of requirements? So that seemed counterintuitive to me. These ideas seemed at odds, and it is. And it goes back to what I opened up with, where we talked about the challenges is that we take old ways of thinking, trying to match them with new ways of measuring and vice versa. And I think that's what's happening here. And I titled the slide, "Following the Crowd is Dangerous," because it's an example that just because the majority of the people say something or do something doesn't necessarily mean it's the right way, the best way. And so we need to look at things critically like that. And the one that really got me was they also said velocity was a measure of success for their projects. And I just want to speak a little bit about that, but velocity is simply a particular team's unique way of identifying what its output pace is. They relatively estimate stories, or they count the number of stories they're doing, whatever that is, but it's that team's unique output pace based on their unique way of estimating, which has no relation to how another team does it. So we don't compare team's velocity to another team's velocity. We don't even really use velocity as a productivity measure. It's more or less, it's just the team's pace, so that we can use that to predict, based on that pace, how much of the backlog they might be able to get through in a given period of time. So to say that it's a success measure for projects, I think is way off. And it's just important to understand that just because a lot of people say it or do it doesn't necessarily mean it's best. So always put a critical eye on these things and understand what's behind them. So what we have is misconceptions equaling bad measures. One of the misconceptions is that Agile success is measured the same way as before. Hopefully we've seen that that's not true. Agile is a completely different mindset and it has different values. So we need to align to those values. That Agile adoption is only about development teams. That is also false. See, it requires changes and continuous improvement throughout the organization because it's not just a development practice, it's a delivery practice. And that Agile is more about outputs and doing more faster. And while that might be an end result of your mature teams, the problem is that we're not focusing enough on value and quality, and that's really what it's about, better outcomes and doing the right thing. So if we're only focused on output measures, we might be measuring the wrong things. So how do you measure the productivity of knowledge work? Well, knowledge work is software development. Software development, most of the time we spend is in thinking. It's the ideas we come up with, the solutions, the problem solving. The actual coding and the output of that coding is a smaller part of the actual work we do. So unlike, some manufacturing thing where we're trying to increase the output, here we're trying to increase the value of that knowledge and what that produces. And so how do you measure that? It's through the value delivered. And we'll talk a little bit about that. So what should we measure then? Well, measure what helps you achieve your outcomes. And when it comes to outcomes, have you considered these? To deliver valuable working software early and often. Business and development teams are one and they're motivated. You have a sustainable pace. You have continuous improvement. And you measure your Agile transformation and maturity progression. So what does that look like? So based on those outcomes, what might we measure? How about at what pace are ideas getting to production? At what pace are the ready stories getting to production? This is your lead time and your cycle time. It's going to help you measure, are you getting working software out early and often, and what is that time? And we'll talk more about that in detail in a bit. User satisfaction for the product is ultimately your measure of value because the end users get to decide if you delivered value or not. We develop things based on a hypothesis, but we got to get it into their hands to find out. So there's the idea of a net promoter score, very simple sliding scale indicator asking the question, would you recommend this product for the intended purpose? Why or why not? How often are features being used or not used? Find ways to measure that. If you spend time delivering something, is it getting used? Is it being adopted? And are there product complaints that you're solving? Are there issues in your product that you get a lot of times from end users? And how well are you addressing those? That's how you're going to know if you're delivering value from an end user's perspective. And the one most often overlooked is team and organizational feedback. So we have team health indicators. We have surveys to collect data around how is the team progressing in their Agile transformation? How is the team progressing in its practices and its mindset? Is the team coming together? Is it working well? The pain points. These kinds of things will give you data so that you can see how your transformation is coming along. And we'll kind of work through these in the next few slides. I actually love the cumulative flow diagram because I think it provides so much data that's really focused around what we're trying to achieve in our outcomes. What we see in this particular example is more of a continuous product development flow, something more similar to what DEIP would be going through versus a project that might start with a big set of scope that needs to be burned down. And so we see with the red is the backlog has a continuous arrival rate of new stories coming in. We also have the orange where you have a steady flow of stories being deployed, so you have a completion rate. And then you have your workflow cycles in between about development and test and releases. What this will show you is, one, lead time. When an idea first hits your backlog until the time it actually gets deployed and can be used. So how quickly are new ideas being fleshed out, developed, and deployed. And your cycle time is more around the actual, once the story is ready, how quickly can we get it to through production and into the user's hands. Those are the two key metrics I think that will help you measure against the continuous flow of working software early and often in those concepts. But this flow will also show you if you have bottlenecks. So if any of these workflow items were to stack up or you'd see sharp changes in them, there's an indication that something's happening there and something for you to dig into and using context. Understand why you have these big bumps or these jagged edges. And speaking of jagged edges, the next slide will show that in great detail. In this chart, we see a lot of choppiness going on here. What I really see is kind of waterfallish activity happening, even if the team in this chart might be trying to do Agile. We see these big orange blocks leading into these slivers of green, and then the yellow, and then ultimately we're releasing the product in these big stair steps on the red. And so everything's happening in bulk and in chunks and all at one time. This is not a continuous flow of delivery. It looks nothing like the last chart, shows a lot of problems to solve. Cumulative flows are great for projects too, and the difference is rather than you see in the backlog progression go from the bottom up with a continuous inflow rate, you're starting with a big backlog. You're starting with a set of scope that you're shooting for, but it still allows for scope to change. So in that orange line midway through, we added some scope. Similar to the example we had earlier where we had some new ideas pop in. Well, let's pop them in. And if they're higher value items, if they deserve to be a higher priority, well, then they'll get worked in and other things will just get pushed down. This also then gives us the ability to project estimated delivery dates. When will that backlog meet the done or the delivered timeline? When will we burn through everything? And so I think really this gives you a more accurate picture of when you'll be done or how much backlog you'll burn through if you have a deadline. So if you overlay a deadline date in here, I think this would be more effective than the traditional project schedules we've been keeping. So cumulative flows work for projects, they work for ongoing delivery of product development, and they provide a lot of information, and when taken in context can really help your team reach its outcomes. So there are some other measures, and I want to go over those a little bit here briefly. So burn down and velocity is probably the most familiar to you. Velocity being something that will help you with sprint planning. So if you are committing the sprint scope, it'll give you an idea of what you can commit to. And then your burn down shows you within your sprint how steady you're moving through the work that you're doing. So it might help you identify development workflow improvements. Good tools for the team and to get better at what they do, not so much a management consumed metric. Risk burn down, so we're all very familiar with risk registers, but this would be using a risk backlog that we actually burn down. And so if you're running a project specifically, you want to be able to burn your risk all the way down or at least minimize it. And so if we're moving risk forward, taking on the highest risk opportunities first, and then as we resolve and take care of the issues that those risks are related to, we watch our risk burn down. Escape defects is something else you might want to track. Obviously, we don't want to introduce new defects when we put new work out, but sometimes it happens. So let's track the rate at which defects are being introduced and then resolved so that we can maintain our quality standards. And then automated test coverage presumes that we'll deliver higher quality and faster delivery the more we can automate. And so a lot of times the teams want to increase their test coverage across their application in an automated fashion. So just a few other things to consider. But what's the best measure of success? To me, it's your Agile transformation progress, because with Agile maturity, you automatically get software delivered more frequently. You get higher value and better quality product. You get continuous improvement in skills and process, and you get a unified, motivated team with sustainable pace who's predictable. So to me, success is centered on how well you adopt the Agile mindset, because if you do this well, the rest just falls into place. So how do you measure your Agile transformation progress? Well, it's going to be through surveys across your team, across your organization that have questions that are specific to your process, your practices, your mindsets. They can have general categories to them. They can be as broad or specific as you want. This slide has some samples of things you might ask. You might ask them in a sense of on a sliding scale of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 or red, yellow, green, how each person feels the team and the organization is doing in each of these areas. This would be a data point that would then feed into some visual charts that you could use to kind of give everybody a quick glance of, are we trending up or are we trending down? Put your results, maybe into something like a spreadsheet, like in this example, where you're kind of giving the score across the teams for each of the principles and the questions, so you kind of get an average rating of where they fit. And you can see that, well, under technical excellence, the team's really struggling with some of its development practices, or a particular team might have more red than another. And here, team 8 has a lot of green, so they're doing really well. And you kind of gauge where you are in a spreadsheet form. And from spreadsheets, you can do all kinds of graphs as well. Another way to present the data would be a chart like this, where it's kind of the red, yellow, green. It shows trending, which kind of gives you an idea, are the scores going up in these areas for these teams? And so in a lot of cases they are, so that means you're making progress. Also gives you a quick indicator of which teams are struggling and where, and what areas need more improvement. And of course everything has context related to it, but these are quick dashboards to help you see the health of your team in terms of its Agile transformation, its practice, and its mindset. So what are some things you might consider when you're putting your measurements together? Well, I would say like predictive schedule and throughput measures like velocity are great for planning and tracking purposes, but they aren't good for measuring actual success in Agile. And measures, just keep in mind, are information that add to a narrative, that show trends, that help us gauge progress toward our outcomes. And when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And this gets into that Hawthorne effect again, that if you have a specific target that you need people to meet, well, they may find a way to meet it, but it may not give you your desired result. And if the team has to game the system in order to meet the result that you're looking for, it might not be a good measure to begin with. Always remember to measure teams rather than individuals, and be willing to stop capturing certain metrics when they've outlived their usefulness. Let's go back to like the idea of measuring escape defects. If you notice that you're letting a lot of defects slip through, you're going to want to start tracking them and to understand the problem. But once you've gotten to the point where you understand the problem and you've found a way to resolve the problem, well, you no longer need to keep tracking that if you're not letting defects escape through anymore. So be willing to let go of certain metrics when they're no longer needed. This slide is just a representation that indicates that your level of success will grow as you move from Agile tactics and output metrics to develop your mindset, which ultimately delivers better outcomes. And then you start focusing on outcome metrics. And so just as you make that transition, that's how your level of success goes up. So in summary, remember that common measures don't necessarily mean good measures. Following the crowd is not always a good thing. Context is everything. What story does that data tell? Measure your outcomes, not your outputs. Track trends, not numbers. Compile all data to tell a narrative. And sometimes changing the system or the process people are working within has a greater impact on outcomes than changing individual performance alone. So this just means focus on your Agile transformation. Well, that concludes this digest. I always welcome your feedback, so please email me at the email address on the screen. Thank you.